My name is Fiona Douglas, and I head up the Dialect and Heritage Project. In this short presentation, I'm going to explain what the project is and how you can get involved. I'll also give you a flavour of some of the fantastic North Yorkshire dialect, photographs, stories and sound recordings we have in our collection. Our story begins in 1946 with Harold Orton, dialectologist and Professor of English Language and Medieval Literature at the University of Leeds. He and Eugen Diet sat down to devise the now world-famous Survey of English Dialects. The survey saw fieldworkers travelling across England, asking some 1,300 questions in each location, and the majority of this fieldwork was done back in the 1950s. In the 1960s, the Institute of Dialect and Folklife Studies was set up, and this continued work on dialect and folklife studies. Fast forward to 2002, and the Leeds Archive of Vernacular Culture was formed, bringing together materials from the survey and the Institute, rescuing them and giving them a new permanent home in the Brotherton Library's special collections. In 2018, the Dialect and Heritage Project received National Lottery Heritage funding, plus funding from university alumni donations, and set out to share the University of Leeds' unique dialect and cultural heritage archives with the nation, and so to continue the story. The Leeds Archive of Vernacular Culture is a large multimedia collection. It has over 2,000 photographs, over 900 audio recordings. It contains all of the responses to the survey's 1,300 questions on everyday objects and ways of life. There are also word, pronunciation and grammar maps. It has the original fieldworkers' notebooks and many other things besides. We'll be looking in more detail at those highlighted in red a little later. This map shows the 313 locations visited by the Survey of English Dialects. As you can see, there are a fair few in Yorkshire. The map also shows our present-day Dialect and Heritage Project museum partners, two of whom are Yorkshire museums, the Dales Countryside Museum in Hawes and the Rydale Folk Museum in Hutton-le-Hole. These are the 9 intrepid fieldworkers who set out from the university across the country. Peter Wright and Stanley Ellis were the ones who covered Yorkshire. The fieldworkers with asterisks against their names were homegrown talent. These were people who had either studied or were still studying for degrees at the university. As you can see, Stanley Ellis was an incredibly prolific fieldworker, visiting 118 locations right across the country. He's pictured on the left, interviewing Tom Mason outside his home in Addingham. The photograph is not quite what it seems, however. This was actually a staged photograph used as the publicity material for the original publication of the survey results. Tom Mason actually wasn't part of the Survey of English Dialects at all. He just happened to be a friend of Stanley Ellis and to live in the right sort of house. The fieldworkers travelled around the country using a variety of modes of transport. There was a survey motorbike which Donald Sykes pictured learned to ride so that he could travel across the country. Others took the train. There was one who tried taking a bicycle, but that was a bit too slow. There was a Project Land Rover, and one fieldworker, Stanley Ellis, who we've already met, even had his very own dialect caravan. When the fieldworkers arrived in the village, one of the first things they had to do was get in touch with Harold Orton back in Leeds to tell him that they had arrived safely. Nowadays, you would just pick up your mobile phone, but of course that technology hadn't been invented yet. And so they would use these letter cards. This is a letter card written by Donald Sykes on arrival in Newport. As you can see, he explains that he's arrived on the same day as the sewage pipe, which he hopes is not going to be a bad omen. And so they would write back explaining whether they had found some people to interview, if they'd found somewhere to stay, and generally to keep Orton informed as to how things were going. So who were the people visited by the survey? I've pulled out a few of the Yorkshire ones to share with you. This is Bill Hewison, standing in the doorway of his house in Bedale in 1952. The informants were predominantly people drawn from rural communities who had spent little or no time away from their home village. Mostly men, because they were less likely to correct their speech, and many of the women who worked at the time worked in service, where they would be more likely to modify how they spoke. And also to people who were intelligent, good talkers, and had a good set of teeth. The latter was particularly important because if you have problems with your teeth, then this will affect how you pronounce things. The survey asked all sorts of different questions. It asked people about farming and agricultural life. It asked about different occupations. It asked people about their words for the objects that they used in everyday life, things that were lying around the house or lying around the farm. As you can see here, it asked questions about baking and cooking. These sorts of questions and questions on laundry were most often, though not always, directed towards women. And you can see that next to some of the possible answers to the questions, there are some little asterisks. Those ones are ones where people were looking for a particular pronunciation of the word. So if you look under baking, the first question there, what do you make your white bread out of? Does the person say flour, or do they say flour, or some other variant? The ones without asterisks were where people were looking for specific words. So there might be different words used to describe things in different parts of the country. And so here are some pages from some of the North Yorkshire fieldworkers' notebooks. These pages were done by Peter Wright. As you can see, he was quite the artist, and he explains quite a lot about the internal workings and architecture of the cow byre. On the far right, you will see the handwritten responses to the individual questions that were asked by the survey that we saw in the last slide. Now you might be thinking, why didn't people just record the answers? Well, as we'll see in the next slide, the reason for that was that the recording equipment at the time was very, very cumbersome, very expensive, and not always terribly reliable. And so the field workers asked the question, and when they got a response, they wrote it down immediately in these field workers' notebooks. So down the left-hand side of the far right image, what you have are the responses to the questions we've just looked at. It's written in something called the International Phonetic Alphabet, which each symbol has a particular representation for a sound. And so it's much more representative of how people actually speak than spelling alone would be. You can see here that the very first answer is that for flour. Then we've got one for meal, one for yeast, and then further down we see that we might be kneading the bread, that we might have a loaf of bread, and so on. Down the right-hand side, they wrote anything else that was of interest but wasn't specifically an answer to one of the survey questions. By the mid-1950s, the technology had developed enough to enable them to go back to some of the original survey villages and make audio recordings. As you can see from the photograph, the equipment was somewhat large and unwieldy, and there are stories told by the field workers of visiting houses without electricity and having to hook the recorder up to the battery of the car or the Land Rover and feed the leads in through the kitchen window in order to make everything work. Here's our old friends Stanley Ellis and Tom Mason engaged in a mock interview. Where they could, they spoke to people they had already interviewed for the survey, but that was not always possible. Charles Armstrong from Stokesley, who was born in 1893, had been visited by the survey some years previously. And here he describes his experiences doing the milk round.
When I got started with a milk round, you know, and I used to sell it wholesale at first, and then I got started with a retail round. Well, I used to be up at 4:30 every morning that he would come, and I used to milk I had 13 cows to milk before I got my breakfast. Hand milk thing on, wasn't machine milking, and I used to have a little clock stuck on table, you know, down at milk house. And I used to milk with that clock. If I was 5 minutes late, I knew I had that 5 minutes in my cup. Folks used to get up with me, you know, when I used to come this house with milk.
Once all the survey results were collated, these maps were produced, which showed the different words and in some cases different pronunciations or grammar that was used in different parts of the country. In this slide, you can see the variation in words to do with brewing tea. Clearly, at the time in Yorkshire, many people were mashing their tea. There's also a map in the centre to describe the little bits of batter that one might get alongside your fish and chips. Do you call it scraps? Do you call it bits? Or do you call it something else entirely? And finally, on the right, we have very many different words to describe a snack. What is it for you? Have you heard the words snap and bait, which were frequently used in Yorkshire? These maps were what Harold Orton was most interested in producing, but unfortunately he died before they were published. Fast forward to the present day and the Dialect and Heritage Project. We invite you to explore more of our fantastic collections and also to contribute to our present day dialect research by visiting our new website or meeting us at some of our events. Our new website at www.dialectandheritage.org.uk has a mini dialect survey and also asks you to contribute your own dialect words and tell us more about the words that you use and where they come from. Perhaps you've inherited words from parents or grandparents. Or perhaps you've adopted new words as you've moved around the country, or perhaps even come from another country. Unlike the Survey of English Dialects, we don't only want to hear from old men with good teeth who've lived in the village all of their lives, though they are welcome too. We want to hear from everyone. So no matter who you are or where you come from, please take part in our present day dialect research. You can find out information about events and activities going on at our partner museums and around the country, also on the website. So during this summer, things will be happening at the Dales Countryside Museum and the Rydal Folk Museum in North Yorkshire. You can follow us on Twitter at Dialect Heritage, or perhaps you'd like to volunteer with us. Become a dialect field worker, following in the footsteps of those intrepid SED field workers and helping us to record present-day dialect. Or perhaps you'd prefer to transcribe present-day or historical dialect recordings, perhaps from your own area or from elsewhere. You could volunteer at one of our museums or help us run some of our events. Or perhaps you'd prefer to be a project publicity advocate, someone who spreads the word and invites other people to take part in the great big dialect hunt. Thank you for listening. We hope to hear from you soon.